All right. Hello and welcome to the Religion Unplugged podcast. I'm Matthew Peterson. Today on the podcast, we have Dr. Kelly James Clark, who is a professor of philosophy at Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul. We will be discussing Dr. Clark's recent interfaith book, The Raging Fire of Love, What I've Learned from Jesus, the Jews, and the Prophet. Kelly, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Matthew.
Yeah. So just to get started, this book is titled the Raging Fire of Love, and all throughout you're constantly describing love and the many words and methods we use to express it. So I'm curious how, when you need to describe it for yourself as either an academic but also just as a person navigating how to love well, how do you define love?
I take an initial stab at it, and the initial stab is without any raging fire, and the initial stab is acting for the good of another person. You know, sensing their need and acting for their good. And a lot of people take love to be just that. That there's and a lot of religious believers take love to be just an action. Love is an action, they'll say. But love is an action, but it's not just an action. And so I think that that love in the Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions adds the raging fire to it, and that is that we're actually supposed to care about the people that we help. And I talk about what that care might be: empathy or sympathy or compassion. That we're supposed to have positive feelings or at least thoughts towards people who are suffering, and then we're supposed to act to relieve their suffering. So it's empathy motivated action that it not just seeks the good of the other, but also acts for the good of the other.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. I know that was probably a how to define love is something obviously we've been working on for as long as we've been around. So I appreciate that.
Well, this was the elevator version. Good place to start.
Yes, exactly. In your book, you say pretty early that from some poll, I think in 2014, it was deduced that 2/3 of people on the planet either don't know that the Holocaust happened or have never been informed that it happened. Either they don't know or they don't believe that it happened.
Yeah.
And this, I think, opens up a larger question about ignorance. In your mind and in your experience, what role has ignorance played in stunting our ability to love?
That's a really good question, and not one I expected.
Okay.
So the biggest problem, I think, when we disagree with people is that we tend to dehumanize people we disagree with. Not everybody. You and I could probably disagree because you have the same color of skin, roughly the same socioeconomic background, and you're an American, and we're probably close to one another in various beliefs. And if we talk long enough, I'd figure it out that you were almost another me in some ways, and it's easier to love another me. But when people who are different from us disagree with us, we tend to think, and you see this all the time in Republican Democrat debates. Now you see, or discussions or online comments, you see that people think that people who disagree with them are not only wrong, which that's just what it means to disagree. You have one belief and they say it's false. You think it's true. So you think the other person is wrong, but you don't just think that. We tend to think that the other person is irrational. And we might think they're immoral. Republicans who support guns or something. My brother's a gun owner. I don't think he's immoral. He and I disagree about the need for gun reform. But we can disagree without me thinking that he's immoral. But I think it's pretty easy for people to think that people they disagree with are immoral. And then often we'll just say, well, you're just crazy. Like they're just crazy to hold that belief. And each one of those steps is a step of dehumanization, where the human is someone who's a lot like me. And then the subhuman is somebody that's not just wrong, but irrational, immoral, crazy. And the problem, I think, is that different groups often have really different sets of information. And most people, and so that's where ignorance comes in. I think if you have information about the Holocaust, your information is right, and it's easy to have a rational belief that the Holocaust occurred. But in many Muslim majority countries around the world, they grow up, and in their schools, they're taught that the Holocaust never happened. If that's your information set, then it's perfectly rational, given your information set, to believe that there wasn't a Holocaust, which makes sympathy towards Jews much harder for Muslims. And there's a lot of anger right now, and I don't blame people, Muslims, for their anger about how Jews are treating Palestinians. But if you lack sympathy, if you think nothing really bad happened to Jews in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, if you think that, then you don't think that that they might deserve a homeland somewhere. Maybe not in Palestine, but you might think that they deserve a place where they can live in peace somewhere. And so anyway, I think ignorance plays a really big role in what's reasonable for people to believe, but it also means that we're going to believe things that are really different. We're going to rationally disagree about all sorts of things. But even though I think the other person is wrong, I don't most of the time think they're irrational, or I need to resist it. Let's put it that way. I do think it. It's like, I think it's an instinct that we have, but it's one that we need to resist because we know people have different sets of information, and it's not all true. And it's not like they're not trying hard to get at the truth. They might still be trying to figure out the truth, but given what they've been given, what's rational for them is going to be different from what's rational for you. And I think that should make us more humble in our assessments, both of ourselves and our intellectual attainments, and other people. It should make us more humble about how we assess the status of other people with respect to beliefs.
Yeah, and kind of all throughout the book, you're kind of constantly talking about specific people from each of the different Abrahamic faith traditions, who have helped you kind of navigate your understanding of the differences and, more importantly, the similarities. Is there like one or two people that you kind of look to as your relationships with them specifically acted as kind of eureka moments for you that sort of changed everything?
Yeah. I talk about this at length. And it's funny, my most transformative relationship with a Jew was with Stuart Shapiro, who's actually an atheist. But he's a practicing Jew because the rest of his family are Orthodox believers. And he invited me into his home, and I talk at length about Shabbat, my first Shabbat experience that I had in his home, but also just the friendship that he had with me was transformative. Like I didn't have Jewish friends. I knew some people who were Jewish. I had there was a Jewish professor in grad school. I went to his house and went for a barbecue, but all my friends were a lot more like me. And the funny thing is that if they weren't Christians, they were lapsed Christians, so I had a lot of atheist and agnostic friends in graduate school, but I didn't have many Jewish or Muslim friends in graduate school. And then when I got out, we didn't hang on people who were like us when I got out of grad school. And Stuart was my first Jewish friend, and it was super transformative for me. And then my other another friendship, and it's the very first story that I talk about in the book, is with Ennis Doko. At the time, I think he was maybe 30, just finishing his PhD in physics with an interest in philosophy. He's from Macedonia, or as they say in Istanbul, Macedonia. which it still gives me a chuckle, I must say. Um, and but he teaches in Turkey. He's at the university I teach, and our friendship it just really grew over the years, and it's been very transformative for me to be friends with him, and not just our friendship. I learned a lot from him about both about Islam. I learned a lot from him about compassion. I learned a lot from him about not being judgmental. And in all honesty, I'd say most of my beliefs about Muslims had been formed by people who were either Christian pastors and weren't Muslims and never knew a Muslim and had only secondhand information about Muslims, and all the information they had was bad, or else I got information from the media. And all we hear about Muslims in the media are bad things. So, I had a lot of biases to overcome, and Ennis really helped me overcome my biases. And he gave me permission to make mistakes. I think that doesn't happen very often in places where people are different. Some people can be really sensitive to mistakes people make, but I advise people to say things even if you make a mistake. And I advise people on the receiving end to listen, even if the other person makes a mistake. And it's just going to happen. It's just inevitable with Muslims, Christians, and Jews coming together that there will be mistakes. And the story I tell about Ennis, if you don't mind, it's the very first story I start with in the book. I directed a 3-year, $1 million grant with Muslims, Christians, and Jews, all except for Ennis. I think everyone had a PhD in philosophy, theology, biology, physics, and some were really high-level academics and published a lot. We met together every year for 3 years. We did a lot of things to get comfortable with one another across our differences. And about 3 days into the first time we met, one of the Jewish scholars walked up to Ennis and looked him in the eye. And I take it as a victory, really, but he looked Ennis in the eye and he said, "You want to kill me, don't you?" The Jewish guy is Israeli. There's a special animosity that Muslims have toward Israel that they don't have towards Jews in general. So he's an Israeli. Anyway, Ennis looked him right back in the eye and said, "No." And but then that wasn't the end of it. Ennis could have been really angry and just walked off, or hurt or insulted and just walked off. Instead, he said, "Come on, let's take a walk. You can ask me anything you want." And they at the retreat center we were at, they took a walk together and talked. They ate dinner together that night. And at the end of the week, at the end of the conference, week-long workshop. At the end of it, we're waiting for taxis to take us to the airport, and they hugged, and then everyone hugged. So it just was a tribute to how much bringing people together and having them meet one another face to face can transform people. And Ennis has done that for me, and I'm grateful to Ennis for that.
Yeah, right. And obviously, one of the first thing that comes up with all of this, and you've already mentioned it, is the whole Israel-Palestine disaster. And pretty early on, you kind of address that, and you say something along the lines of, and you can correct me if I kind of am over summarizing this, something along the lines of, what we first need to do before we get into that is care for the Muslim and Jewish neighbors directly in our circles. And then you later also say, you talk about who is my neighbor, and how essentially we should be ready and willing to love people from all over the globe. And I'm curious, how do we navigate having a love for humanity that is extremely local and extremely global simultaneously?
Yeah. So I just found out, you people in podcast land, that Matthew is only 20, but he's asking some darn good questions.
Appreciate it.
Some of the better questions that I've been asked. So it's way easier to cultivate empathy for members of our family and extended family. So like if you're a churchgoer, then people in your church. If you're Jewish, people that are in your synagogue, maybe, it's way easier to cultivate empathy for people who are close to you. In the Quran, it calls them our close neighbors or our near neighbors, depending on the translation. But it's way harder to cultivate empathy for our distant neighbors or far neighbors, and especially hard to cultivate empathy for enemies. In fact, I think if you fear somebody, I think it's probably impossible to cultivate empathy for them. And so I discuss the problem that creates in Islam for love of enemy. And it's a problem that we all have, that if we fear somebody else as an enemy, it's really hard to cultivate empathy for them. And yet, and so this is what I think we're supposed to do for people who are far away. If we can't have, there are two kinds of empathy, emotional empathy and cognitive empathy. And I think it's pretty hard to generate the raging fire of love for people who are far away or people who are enemies. And yet we're supposed to have some understanding of what it's like to be them, and that's cognitive empathy. And I use the story when I talk about love in the Jewish tradition, that God sees the cries of his people in captivity in Egypt. He hears the cries of his people and he comes down. And so there's the empathy is that I don't know what it's like to be God, so don't get me wrong on this, but I think we're supposed to hear the cries of people who are suffering, and we're supposed to act. And that's what God did. But sometimes the cries are harder to hear because of distance, or maybe impossible to hear because of our fears. But then I think we're still supposed to try to come to some understanding of what it must be like, what it might be like to be them. And then to be able to relate to that, to think, yeah, I've suffered like that too. I understand it. And then determine how best to act. So people far away, I think it's a different kind of empathy. But here's the thing. If you don't have it, you won't be kind to people far away. You won't give money to charities for people far away. If you do not have any empathy, cognitive or affective or emotional, for people who are far away, people just don't act. So without it, the world just isn't going to be a better place. And in order to make the world a better place where peace in the end wins, it requires us to try to understand what it might be like to be. Here's the hard thing right now. What for an Israeli Jew to understand what it might be like to be a Palestinian Arab, and then to understand why living in occupation might make you want to strike back. That doesn't justify what Hamas did, but I think it helps us understand what Hamas did. And if you understand that, then you might act differently in response. And the same would be true for the Palestinian Arab, to try to understand what it's like for a people to be hounded and persecuted for 2,000 years and then to suffer through the Holocaust. The need for them to have a place or a home, to live in peace and to live without fear. So it could and should have gone both ways, but it didn't. In fact, what both sides were doing was encouraging the dehumanization of the other side. Then it makes it not so hard to want to hurt them and even kill them.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I can just take it, the whole conversation a little bit more personal.
Yeah.
You're talking about all three of the Abrahamic religions, but you ascribe to Christianity. You call it your spiritual home several times. So in all of like the respect that you've grown in for Judaism and for Islam and for all the friends you have across all of it, what is it about Christianity that has been distinct, and why is that the one that you've chosen to cling to?
Yeah. So in some ways, I think our religions choose us, that God chooses us. I used to be a hyper Calvinist, and I thought God chose everybody. and not many people, and most of the people were going to go to hell. That's what I thought before, and partly so. So I know that my spiritual home is something that's really familiar to me. In Judaism and Islam will always be foreign to me. I'll always be an outsider, even though I've had unbelievable hospitality on the parts of Jews and especially Muslims. But it will always seem a little strange to me in ways that Christianity won't. And so this has created for me an understanding of how Christianity will seem strange to Muslims and Jews. For example, I think most Christians don't understand how strange it is to believe in the Trinity and the incarnation, to believe that God was a human being, that the infinite became finite, that the infinite spirit became embodied in the form of a baby. Even in the Bible, it says that the incarnation is an offense to the Greeks, a folly to the Greeks, the rational people, and an offense to the Jews, who were strict monotheists. They didn't think there were like two gods, and one was on earth and one was up in heaven. And I think Christians don't understand how foreign that seems to people raised in different religious backgrounds and cultures. And I don't think that's the only reason I think Christianity still has a lot going for it. But I do want to admit in this context of interfaith dialogue and in the spirit of interfaith dialogue that what seems like home to us means that we'll find the other religions foreign, and we'll always feel a little bit outsider in those. And that's not a feeling we like. I like the feeling of home and inclusion. And so Christianity is really easier for me. Right. There's more to be said there, but it's not my point here to say why I'm not a Jew and why I'm not a Muslim in this context. But bottom line, I do want to say, even if I disagree with my Jewish and Muslim friends, I respect them. I think they're rational, even on points where we disagree. And I think that there are big points on which we agree, including on God's command that we love people who are different from us.
Yeah. And how has studying these other belief systems added to and just made your view of God more complex and more holistic? What are the pieces of Allah and the pieces of Yahweh that you've taken and you've added to the principles you understood about Jesus to make God more holistic? I guess that's the word.
Yeah. So one thing that I can't believe is that God left vast swaths of people all over the world without information about himself. And so I don't think there's a least common denominator that we all need to agree on or anything. And I'm not looking for that. I look at what I have asked Muslims and Jews to do in projects that I have been involved in is to speak and write from their own faith perspectives. If they are people who think that their faith perspectives calls them to hate people who are different from them, well, I don't invite them to be part of my project. I try to identify people whose understanding of their own traditions is one that grounds compassion for people who are different from them. So I don't invite ISIS to be part of my projects or the Taliban, or I might invite them to be part of a discussion, and I think it'd be worthwhile to be part of a discussion. And I think there's lots of things that could happen, but I try to find thought leaders that I think are on the side of compassion and peace from their own religious perspective. Now, you asked me a question, and I've wandered away a bit.
No, no, that's fine because that was interesting too.
Okay.
I just asked how has
Uh,
understanding each different view of God informed your
yeah.
view of God and made it bigger.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say is this: there's this one line in one of C.S. Lewis books where one of the Aslan is the Christ figure in there, and one of the kids in the book says, "Aslan, you're so much bigger." And Aslan said, "No, no, my child, you're bigger. Like you see God bigger and better when you grow." And learning about Islam and Judaism has made me, I think, better, bigger, a bigger view of God. It's I think that I had a pretty punitive view of God, and I think that's a young man's religion, to like power, and to see the world as black and white. So to see violators as people deserving of punishment, and not to see gray. And so what's helped me is to see that the world, this gets back to your ignorance question, that we're all under some veil of ignorance, and that we're all doing the best we can. And I didn't think that before. I thought this before, that Muslims had really adequate information about the Jesus of the Gospels and chose instead to follow the prophet. That they willfully and were fully informed, and they were shaking their fists at God, who revealed himself in Jesus. And I just can't look at Muslims that way anymore. I think they don't have the same sort of information that I have. It hasn't been presented to them in the same way. There are different ways that they value things. Anyway, it's made me bigger and more generous, and I think it's made my view of God bigger and more generous. I was part of a discussion yesterday where people talked about, should you teach the doctrine of hell to these are Christian philosophers, to your children? And some person says, well, I don't see any empirical evidence that it's damaging to children. And I wrote back, there is some empirical evidence that it's damaging to adults, that it's psychologically damaging to adults to think that there's an eternal torture chamber that awaits people that don't believe in God just like you do. I think it is spiritually damaging to think of God as ultimately punitive, and to think that God could be the kind of person that tortures unbelievers for eternity. I think there's just some defect in that. And I learned about, I wrote a chapter on hell in another book that I wrote called God and the Problems of Love for Cambridge University Press. And I don't think hell is much of a problem for Jews. I don't think many of them concern themselves with it that much. I think most of them are more concerned about how we live this life, although a lot of them do believe in the afterlife. And a lot of Muslims, I came to realize, think that people are punished only according to what they're due. And so no one's due in the Muslim afterlife. No one who's lived a bad life deserves eternal torment. So a lot of Muslims think that people are punished for a while, and then, well, what happens? Maybe they stop existing, or maybe they end up in heaven. Some people do think it's eternal, but none of them think that hell is anywhere near as bad as medieval Christian theologians do, and a lot of contemporary Christians do. And so learning about that made me think in very different ways about God and about justice and about compassion.
Yeah, and now I'd like to go down to you sort of end the book with 3 practices that one from each of the faiths that you think all people could sort of do well to be a part of, add to their lives. With the you talk about Christian hospitality, Islamic prayer, and Jewish practice of taking the Sabbath. How did you land on those 3 things? And if you could just kind of briefly explain why you think each of those things are so important.
Yeah. So I end the book with a chapter called Rituals of Love. And I end it with that because I think we all way overestimate how loving we are.
Mm.
We all overestimate how good we are. And I write a lot about why love is so hard, why psychologically we're constructed in ways that make love difficult to attain. And so I get to the end of the book and I say all three of the traditions, I think that love is a virtue, but it's really hard to acquire. And so they have rituals that are supposed to make us more loving. And I picked the rituals because in some ways, the experiences I had of people participating in those rituals was really transformative for me. But I picked them because I picked a ritual that tries to move us a little off center, to move ourselves off center towards love of God. I think the first step is to give up our inordinate love for ourselves. And I'm not against all love for self, but inordinate love for self. I think we're selfish, and I think each of the traditions recognizes that. And so the first step is to stop worshiping ourself, and that can be worshiping God, who's the source of love, and attaching yourself to God, who's the source of love. And so the first step is towards God, but that's our first step towards loving other people. And I experienced that. So the example I pick is prayer in Muslims, and they pray 5 times a day. Not all of them. I have learned this over the years that there's no true sentence that begins with the Muslims. There's no way you could finish that sentence that would be true of all Muslims at all time. I know some Muslims that pray 3 times a day, some that pray once a day. I know some people call themselves Muslims who never pray. I know some people call themselves Muslims who are agnostics or even atheists, but they're culturally Muslim. At any rate, the practice for probably most Muslims is 5 times a day. People do it in their homes. They don't go to a mosque to do it very often. They have a room in their home sometimes with a rug that's pointed towards Mecca. And I grew up thinking that the Muslims were the most idolatrous, and that they were the most trying to sort of show God how faithful they were, and that their ritual practices were just kind of showing off to God. And I thought, we're saved by faith, not works, and Muslims were the worst works people. And that 5 times a day prayer was one of the worst things that you could do, and then bowing in prayer when you do it. And I got invited to a house of some people I met. I went to a Friday prayers in a mosque, and some people talked to me afterwards about the Friday prayers, what it meant to them. And then I went to their house for a meal, and during the meal, we all heard the call to prayer, and then one person at a time went to somewhere. I didn't know where they went. I actually, at that time, I thought people just went to the mosque 5 times a day to pray. And I finally said, where's everybody going? What's going on? What's everybody doing? Because each person had got up and left and gone somewhere and come back a few minutes later. And they said, well, they went off to pray. And they said, come here. And one of them took me into the room where they prayed, and he said, this is where we do it. He showed me the prayer rug, and I said, well, what are your prayers? And they all begin with this, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. And then they repeat, in the name of Allah, the compassionate, the merciful. Every prayer, 5 times a day, begins with that. And they bow down. And I suspect bowing down initially is just a rote activity that people do. But I take it the point is, in the bowing, that you're trying to make your body do something over and over and over again in a way that changes your spirit to a point where you really think there's only one God, and it's not me. And it's not my culture, and it's not my tribe. There's just one God, and that God is compassionate and merciful. And I began to see like what rituals are supposed to do, that you move your body a lot and eventually your spirit or your heart follows along. And you just do this over and over and over again. And so I began to think, as I say in the book, that it wouldn't be a bad practice for anybody, Muslim, Christian, Jew, atheist, or agnostic, to bow down 5 times a day and say, I am not God, and to try to connect with the compassionate and the merciful, and then to move out from that into the world. So that's the first step. And then the second step was Shabbat, the Sabbath meal. And I talk about my first Sabbath meal with Stuart Shapiro's family. And there were members of the family plus members of the community that came together. And I think that you begin to learn love for people, for other people. You learn it first in your home, in your family, and also in your extended family. That's just where it starts. And we have a natural built-in empathy. Parents do for their children, and children do for their parents. It gets more difficult, of course, as they grow up, but they have to learn through these various rituals over and over what it means to have empathy for your parent when you're an infant, and then when you're middle school, and then teenager, and then adult. You learn that every Friday from dawn to dusk. You're in a place and you have a role, and you do this thing over and over. You're part of a community, and I think Shabbat brings people together, not just to rest, but to, and again, this relates to the kind of monotheism of the first ritual, to cease being God. And that means to stop creating. You're not the creator. So one day a week, you stop creating, you stop working, and you rest. And you realize you're not the creator, but you realize you're finite, contingent. You were brought up by these parents at this time, and it's from your parents that you learn goodness and joy and beauty and love and the shapes that it takes. And so there we learn a love that goes outside of ourselves to different members of our family and our extended family. So I thought that was a good second step to talk about. And then the final step, I talk about the Christian virtue of hospitality. And I talk about that big, and I have a brief interlude to talk about how we can be really good at love of our family, or even members of our extended family, and why we're not so good at members who are to people who are outside of our tribe. We're kind of naturally inclined to be tribal. And so the first 2 forms of love they're not easier, but they're easier. And the hardest form of love is for people who are outside our tribe. That's the hardest to cultivate. And so each of the 3 traditions has this. So I talk about it from the Christian tradition, and that's the virtue of hospitality. And it's a virtue, which means it's a character trait that we're supposed to acquire. And I talk about how it's different from evangelism. So a lot of Christians want to have people over to their house because they want to tell them what to believe. And the virtue of hospitality is not supposed to be intended to change the person you invite over. It's supposed to change you. It's a virtue that you acquire. And the virtue is one where you show kindness and compassion to the needs of others. You listen to them and you meet their needs. And I think Christians often aren't good listeners. I talk about that a little bit in the book. And I don't say anything against evangelism. Christians can do that. But that's a different practice than the practice of trying to acquire the virtue of hospitality, which aims at love of stranger and even enemy. And it aims at meeting their needs. And it involves respect for people who are different from you, and honor for people who are different from you. I think in the New Testament times, you might bow and wash the feet of someone who enters into your home. And well, none of us would do that in this day and age. But I think bowing and washing feet would be a really good humility cultivator, especially for people that you didn't like, or maybe you thought stinky. These are dirty feet after all. And anyway, I think it's that doing those sorts of activities are supposed to move us into a position where we begin to look at people. Well, we began to expand the circle of us. We begin to expand the circle of compassion. And I think you asked about Israel and Palestine before. I think Israel and Palestine is really distracting when we're talking about interfaith issues. And when I travel around the country or I speak to college students, especially if I'm with a Jewish partner when I'm talking about this, everyone always wants to talk about Israel and Palestine, and we really can get off topic. Because I think what happens with Israel Palestine is it makes us think that interfaith is their problem. It's like a Jew or a Muslim problem. It happens over there, and we forget that bias towards people who are different from us is my problem, and it takes us off track. And hospitality is the virtue that keeps us on track. I'm supposed to open my door to people who are different from me because of the benefit it brings to me. It makes me more respectful and compassionate. It makes me honor people the way God honors people. And the list could go on of the kind of person you would be if you had the virtue of hospitality. Anyway, this, I think, moves these three virtues in the way that I've structured it, moves us from self to family, and then family to other, where, other with a capital O, people who are really different from us.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Kelly. That was all very insightful, and I really appreciated your time today. It was really, really informative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I hope our paths cross in person.
Me too. That would be lovely.
Yeah.
All right. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right. Take care. Bye.